It was the late winter of 1945, a time when the sky over Europe was perpetually gray, choked with the smoke of burning cities and the vapor trails of Allied bombers. 76 years ago, the Third Reich, once a regime that boasted it would last 1,000 years, was stumbling blindly toward the abyss of total collapse. The most horrific conflict in human history was drawing to a close, yet the final act remained unwritten and deeply controversial. The war would officially end just 4 months later, but a question has haunted historians, strategists, and veterans for decades. Why did the American and British forces, with their overwhelming mechanical superiority, not press forward to capture Berlin? Why was the heart of the Nazi beast left to be carved out by the bayonets of the Soviet Red Army? According to William L. Shirer, the renowned author of The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and backed by the analysis of military historians, the answer lies not solely in logistics or politics, but in the dark machinations of one man. It was a psychological operation of unprecedented scale, orchestrated by the twisted genius of the Nazi propaganda machine, Dr. Joseph Goebbels. This is the story of the final desperate bluff of the Berlin regime, a lie so potent it diverted the mightiest armies on earth and reshaped the map of post-war Europe. By February 1945, the writing was not just on the wall, it was etched in blood across the snow-covered landscapes of the German frontier. There was virtually no chance left for Nazi Germany to turn the tide of war. The days of the Blitzkrieg were a distant memory, replaced by a grim struggle for mere survival. 6 months prior, the Allies had stormed the beaches of Normandy, breaking the Atlantic Wall and sweeping across France. In the West, the combined forces of the United States and Great Britain were hammering at the gates of the fatherland. Simultaneously, in the East, the Soviet Union had launched a storm of vengeance. The Red Army's Operation Bagration and subsequent offensives had shattered the Wehrmacht Army Group's center, a catastrophe from which the German military would never recover. However, the collapse was not merely military, it was systemic. The defeat on the battlefield was only one part of a grimmer, grayer picture, one painted in the drab colors of industrial starvation. Under the relentless round-the-clock bombing campaigns of the U.S. Army Air Forces by day and the Royal Air Forces by night, the German industrial heartland had ceased to beat. The Ruhr Valley, once the forge of German steel and weaponry, had been reduced to a lunar landscape of twisted metal and cratered earth. Crucially, the Upper Silesia region, a vital source of raw materials on the eastern side of the continent, had fallen to the advancing Soviet forces. The impact on the German war machine was catastrophic. Coal, the bloodline of the 1940s economy, was virtually disappeared. Production had plummeted to a mere 20% of the previous year's output. But even if the coal could be mined, it could not be moved. The Allied air supremacy was total. Fighter bombers prowled the skies, strafing anything that moved. The railway network, the arteries of the Reich, had been severed. Canals were blocked by sunken barges. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, the commander of the Kriegsmarine and soon-to-be successor of Hitler, lamented in despair. He reported that countless ships under his command were rendered useless, forced to sit permanently in harbor, rusting at anchor because there was no coal to fire their boilers. On land, the situation was equally dire. Hundreds of power plants fell silent. Munitions factories, desperate to churn out shells for the front lines, stood idle in the dark. The Third Reich was running out of power, literally and metaphorically. If coal was the muscle of the economy, oil was the blood of the military. By early 1945, the lack of fuel had become the terminal disease of the German armed forces. In the early years of the war, before the disastrous invasion of Russia, Adolf Hitler had prioritized the seizure of oil fields in Romania and the ambitious drive toward the Caucasus in Ukraine. He understood that modern war was a war of engines, but by 1945, those conquests were lost. The Wehrmacht had been pushed back deep into its own territory. Compounding this strategic disaster was the targeted destruction of Germany's synthetic oil plants. These facilities, technological marvels that converted coal into liquid fuel, were the primary targets of Allied strategic bombing. As they burned, so did the Luftwaffe's ability to fight. Germany possessed advanced aircraft, including the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Yet these terrifying machines were largely grounded. They sat on camouflaged runways, impotent and vulnerable, waiting to be destroyed by Allied strafing runs because there was no fuel to fly them. Pilots were available, but the tanks were dry. The armored divisions fared no better. The Panzerwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had been decimated. The turning point had been the Battle of Kursk in 1943, a titanic clash of steel where the technical superiority of German Tigers and Panthers was overwhelmed by the sheer numerical mass of Soviet T-34s. By 1945, the famed Panzer divisions were shadows of their former selves. Even when tanks were produced, they lacked the fuel to maneuver. Many were abandoned by their crews on the side of the road, heavily armored steel husks rendered useless by an empty fuel gauge. As winter turned to spring, the Western Allies began their final push. In late February 1945, American, British, and French forces approached the Rhine River, the last great natural barrier protecting the heart of Germany. On March 7, 1945, in a stroke of luck that would become legendary, soldiers of the U.S. 9th Armored Division found the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact. They stormed across, securing a foothold on the eastern bank. Within days, the river was breached in multiple locations. The momentum was unstoppable. General George S. Patton's Third Army, moving with his characteristic aggression, drove his tanks relentlessly eastward. To the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded the British and Canadian forces, pushing through the Ruhr and into the northern plains. By March 18, 1945, Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production, wrote a memo that was essentially an obituary for the nation. He noted that within 4 to 8 weeks, the German economy would totally collapse. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. Chaos reigned at the Führer's headquarters. Outside, the maps showed disaster. The British and Canadians under Montgomery were sweeping toward Hamburg and the Baltic coast. The U.S. 9th Army had encircled the Ruhr, trapping hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. By April 11th, American spearheads reached the Elbe River at Magdeburg. They were only 100 kilometers or 60 miles from Berlin. At that moment, the road to the capital was wide open. Berlin was defended by a ragtag collection of depleted units, the Volkssturm, Home Guard, consisting of old men and teenage boys, and the remnants of battered SS divisions. The U.S. Army could have reached the Reich Chancellery within days, but they stopped.
The decision to halt at the Elbe remains one of the most debated moments of the 20th century. The desperate plea to take Berlin came from none other than British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. A man of deep historical foresight, Churchill distrusted Joseph Stalin. He argued passionately that the Western Allies must shake hands with the Russians as far east as possible. He wanted the Union Jack and the Stars and Stripes flying over the Reichstag, not just to defeat Hitler, but to establish a position of strength for the post-war order. However, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, saw things differently. Eisenhower was a pragmatist, focused on military objectives rather than political symbolism. His intelligence reports suggested that Berlin was merely a prestige target. The city was a ruin, its strategic value negligible compared to the cost of taking it. Eisenhower famously stated that he was not interested in sacrificing 100,000 American lives for a prestige objective. Furthermore, the geopolitical lines had been drawn at the Yalta Conference. Germany was to be divided into zones of occupation. Berlin lay deep within the Soviet zone. Even if the Americans took it, they would eventually have to hand it over to the Russians. Eisenhower, communicating directly with Stalin, assured the Soviet leader that the Allied push would halt at the Elbe. But there was another reason for Eisenhower's hesitation, a reason rooted in fear, misinformation, and the phantom menace created by Joseph Goebbels. As the Third Reich crumbled, Allied intelligence agencies began intercepting strange reports. Since late 1944, rumors had swirled about a national redoubt, Alpine Redoubt, a legendary fortress being constructed in the impassable mountains of Bavaria and Western Austria. This was the masterstroke of Joseph Goebbels. Seeing that the conventional war was lost, Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, spun a web of deceit designed to terrify the Allied command. The narrative was terrifyingly plausible. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi elite would not die in Berlin. Instead, they would retreat to the jagged peaks of the Alps, centered around Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. The reports, fed by Nazi leaks and swallowed by Allied spies, painted a picture of an impregnable stronghold. The fortress, the reports claimed, is defended by nature itself. Sheer cliffs, eternal ice, and narrow passes make it impossible for tanks to penetrate. But Goebbels added details that played on the deepest fears of the Allied generals. Intelligence suggested that the Nazis had moved their most critical industries underground into hollowed-out mountains. There, they were stockpiling food, ammunition, and raw materials to last for years. More terrifying was the prospect of the werewolves. Goebbels proclaimed that a new army was being formed, an elite guerrilla force of fanatical Nazi youth trained in mountain warfare and sabotage. They would strike from the shadows, turning the occupation of Germany into a never-ending nightmare of assassinations and ambushes. And then there was the threat of the Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons. Goebbels had long boasted of secret technology that would reverse the war's outcome. The Allies had already seen the V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets rain terror on London. They had seen the fleeting speed of German jets. Now, the fear was that in this Alpine fortress, German scientists were putting the final touches on weapons of mass destruction, perhaps even atomic capabilities that could be launched from the safety of the mountains.
The intelligence picture presented to Eisenhower was a hallucination, but it looked like a photograph. One report warned, if the German High Command retreats to the redoubt, they can hold out for years. They will reorganize, manufacture new weapons in bomb-proof factories, and launch a guerrilla war that will bleed the Allies dry. Eisenhower's chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, expressed deep concern. The prospect of a prolonged campaign in the treacherous terrain of the Alps was a nightmare scenario. It conjured images of American troops being picked off by snipers in snowy passes, fighting a war that would drag on into 1946 or 1947. Eisenhower, ever the cautious strategist, decided he could not ignore this threat. The risk of leaving a fully armed Nazi bastion in his rear was too great. And so, the order was given. The spearhead of the American advance was turned away from Berlin. General Patton's Third Army and General Jacob Dever's Sixth Army Group were ordered to swing south, toward Bavaria and Austria. Their mission? To cut off the retreat of the German government and crush the National Redoubt before it could become fully operational. In reality, the National Redoubt was a ghost story. There were no underground factories. There were no stockpiles of food. The werewolf organization was disorganized and ineffective.
The fortifications existed only on paper and in the fevered broadcasts of Joseph Goebbels. Hitler had no intention of fleeing to the mountains. He had resolved to die in the ruins of his capital. But the lie worked. It bought the Nazi regime a few more weeks of existence, and crucially, it shifted the center of gravity of the Western Allied events away from Berlin. Because of this strategic diversion, the path to Berlin was left open, not to the Americans, but to the Russians. Marshal Georgy Zhukov was not deterred by myths. He amassed a force of 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 7,500 aircraft. The Red Army, fueled by a desire for retribution for the millions of Soviet citizens killed by the Nazis, launched their final assault on the Seelow Heights and then on Berlin itself. The ensuing Battle of Berlin was an apocalypse. It was a street-by-street, house-by-house slaughter. But had the Americans pressed on, history might have looked very different. The Cold War division of Europe, the Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain, all were shaped by the final military positions of 1945. In the end, Joseph Goebbels' deception was his final victory, a Pyrrhic one. He could not save the Third Reich, nor could he save himself. On May 1, 1945, in the bunker beneath the Chancellery, Goebbels and his wife Magda poisoned their 6 children and then took their own lives, following their Führer into oblivion. But the legacy of his lie remained. The Alpine fortress stands as one of history's greatest examples of psychological warfare. It proved that in war, the mind is a battlefield as critical as the ground itself. A fabricated story, repeated with conviction and planted in the right ears, shifted the movement of million-man armies and dictated the geopolitical future of the world for the next half-century. Goebbels, the master of the big lie, had proven his own theory one last time. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it, even the supreme commander of the Allied forces.
As the dust settled in May 1945, Allied troops sweeping through Bavaria found no impregnable fortress. They found only the breathtaking beauty of the mountains and the scattered remnants of a broken army. The V-2 rockets were silent. The underground factories were unfinished tunnels. The war ended not with the bang of a secret weapon, but with the unconditional surrender of a devastated nation. Yet the shadow of that final deception lingers, a reminder of how misinformation can alter the course of history just as effectively as a tank division. The map of Europe had been redrawn, not just by the blood of soldiers, but by the ink of a propagandist.